Welcome to Beat Cancer, the official podcast of the UC Davis Comprehensive Cancer Center. Thanks for joining us today as we have in-depth discussions of the science, research, and advancements taking place at our National Cancer Institute designated Comprehensive Cancer Center. I'm Chris Joyce.
And I'm Stephanie Winn. We will also examine proactive approaches to cancer prevention, and most importantly, how we are breaking barriers to beat cancer in our community and beyond. Today, we'll be discussing cancer clinical trials and how our Office of Clinical Research works to provide support and oversight within our clinical trial studies. Joining us today is Dr. Megan Daly, a radiation oncologist and the Associate Director for Clinical Research. Nice to have you with us, Dr. Daly.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Let's start with the basics. How do clinical trials work?
Clinical trials are studies that patients can take part in that test new cancer treatments, new imaging modalities, new ways of managing symptoms. Really anything that is not currently part of the standard of care can be tested in a clinical trial, or even two different standards of care can be compared in a clinical trial. So they're how we move forward with cancer treatment, and actually across medicine. They're how we move forward in the treatment and diagnosis and management of patients. Clinical trials are what have allowed almost all of the developments in cancer therapies over the past 50 or so years.
This is how we get to those big breakthroughs, right?
Exactly.
And it's the clinical trials are divided into three phases, correct? Explain how that works.
Correct. So phase 1 clinical trials are our early clinical trials where we're looking primarily at safety. We're testing often what the appropriate dose of a new therapeutic agent. These are oftentimes, they're not always done in a dose escalation fashion. So they may be starting at a very low dose of a new therapy and gradually, after every several patients are assessed for safety, increasing the dose slightly to systematically test what is the safe dose of a drug that can be given. Once we move into phase 2, we're looking for preliminary signals of efficacy. These are oftentimes done as a single-arm trial where all the patients receive the same treatment. And then our practice-changing trials are our randomized phase 3 trials, where we're truly comparing a new treatment approach to a standard of care. So these are typically randomized trials where patients who agree to take part are randomized between the standard of care therapy and a new therapy. And ultimately at the end, we can see whether the new therapy is superior to, equal to, or inferior to the older standard of care.
It's very exciting as you see these drugs and treatments progress through these various phases. Huh?
It's incredibly exciting. Randomized phase 3 trials are really what bring new therapies to us. At the same time, they're also how we avoid implementing new therapies that don't actually work. A negative randomized trial is also important in avoiding a therapy that may not be better for our patients.
There's a lot of myths that surround clinical trials. Can you tell us a little bit about some of those, maybe debunk some of them, or provide a positive outlook on some of these with the correct information?
Absolutely. So there's definitely a lot of myths around clinical trials. One is that half the patients on any trial are going to get a placebo. So that is absolutely not true. So first of all, many of our trials are not even randomized. Many of our earlier phase trials, our phase 1 and phase 2 trials, every patient will be getting the new experimental treatment. And in any randomized trial, especially in cancer care, the patients who are on the control arm, who are not getting the experimental arm, are getting the standard of care therapy. So they're typically getting the therapy that they would have received if they had not been enrolled in a clinical trial. So by choosing to take part in that randomized trial, they're giving themselves a 50% chance of getting the experimental therapy either in addition to or instead of the standard of care therapy. So just to give an example, in, say, the space that I tend to work in lung cancer, a randomized phase 3 trial for patients with stage 3 lung cancer, the patients on the standard of care control arm would receive radiation and chemotherapy, and the patients on the experimental arm might receive radiation, chemotherapy, and an additional drug. There's certainly a Also myths around patients sort of being treated as guinea pigs. And, I would absolutely want to assure patients that that is not the case. The investigators here at UC Davis and really at any NCI designated cancer center take clinical trials incredibly seriously. There are huge safeguards for patient safety and for patient privacy. We are so deeply grateful to our patients for taking part in studies that can allow perhaps not only benefit to them, but also benefit to future patients. And really by taking part in a clinical trial, oftentimes patients actually get an extra layer of support because they also have the clinical trial team checking in with them and looking out for them in addition to their own doctors.
When I've interviewed some of these patients that have enrolled in our clinical trials, they are so devoted to science and so devoted to the cancer fight. That has really what has struck me is they know that there is no guarantee that their cancer will be cured, but they're doing it because, as you said, Dr. Daly, they're wanting to get to that point where we will be able to cure cancer, and they know that clinical trials are so critical to that progress.
Absolutely. I hear that from my own patients all the time. I'd say many, if not all of our patients have benefited from previous clinical trials that prior patients have chosen to take care of. So many of our patients who have benefited from these advances want to be able to give back to science and to future patients in the same way.
And these are, some of our sickest patients, correct?
To be honest, there's clinical trials across all phases of cancer. We also have clinical trials in early stage cancers where we may even be looking at de-escalating treatments. There's a number of clinical scenarios where the clinical trials are actually not looking at being more aggressive. They're looking at, are we possibly being a little bit too aggressive? Should we back off a little bit on that radiation dose or on the duration of that endocrine therapy or on the number of cycles of chemotherapy? Can we still maintain the high cure rates that we've achieved in prior clinical trials in our lowest risk patients with slightly reduced schedules? So for example, Hodgkin's lymphoma is a great example of this. Clinical trial, Hodgkin's lymphoma until the 50s was a uniformly fatal disease. Then through early clinical trials, it was discovered that a combination of aggressive radiation and chemotherapy could cure many patients with Hodgkin's lymphoma. At the same time, many Hodgkin's patients are young, and many of them would live for decades, and they would oftentimes have very serious long-term side effects from that aggressive chemotherapy and that aggressive radiation. So a series of really well-done clinical trials over the ensuing decades have allowed us to gradually, markedly reduce both the chemotherapy and the radiation that is used for Hodgkin's lymphoma patients. And these have been trials that have enrolled thousands of patients. Many of them have been conducted in Europe. We've had some of them open here at UC Davis as well. So at this point, the treatment of Hodgkin's is still as effective, if not more effective, than it was with those early aggressive regimens, but it's far, far less toxic.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. And it's interesting also that we do have ones that aren't only looking to add additional medicines, but reduce them as well. Well, is every patient eligible for a cancer clinical trial?
Unfortunately, not always. There's certainly rare tumor types, for example, that we may not currently have a clinical trial available. All clinical trials have eligibility criteria that are designed to have a relatively homogeneous population of patients enrolled to make the data easier to interpret. And at the same time, there has really been a push through the National Cancer Institute and just globally in the clinical trials community to make our eligibility criteria more reflective of the patients who will ultimately be receiving the treatments. So we have tried to really reduce those barriers to enrollment, like strict guidelines about prior cancer diagnoses, perhaps many years ago, or other medical comorbidities that used to exclude patients from trials, but we've realized actually many patients with those other medical problems may ultimately be taking part in those treatments once they're approved. So we want them to be part of the process of determining whether those treatments work in a real-world patient population. So unfortunately, not every patient at our center is currently eligible for one of our trials, but we are trying so hard to diversify our portfolio so that we have a trial for as many patients as possible. Oftentimes, if there's not a treatment trial available to one of our patients, there may be an imaging trial. We have trials testing new imaging modalities in cancer. Some very exciting things going on with different types of PET scans, different MRI modalities. There's lots of interesting imaging research. There can even be blood banking research, testing for blood markers for cancer, things related to early detection, following patients, monitoring, detecting early recurrences early. So any patient who is interested in clinical trials should absolutely ask one of their cancer doctors if they are eligible for a trial.
Is that the best place to start, with your doctor, your oncologist, or what are some of the other ways you can find out about our clinical trials?
Well, I would highly encourage any patient interested in a clinical trial to start with their doctor. All of our oncologists are well aware of our clinical trial portfolio. That can include your medical oncologist, your radiation oncologist, your surgeon. We also have a lot of information on our UC Davis website about our clinical trials, too, if any of our patients want to peruse the list of trials in addition to talking to their doctor.
How important is it to get a diverse patient population, I guess, so that does it matter if we're only getting one subset of our community, or do the studies benefit from having a wide swath of subjects?
It's incredibly important that we have a diverse and representative population of patients in our trials. These are treatments that are going to hopefully eventually become part of the standard of care, and we need to know if they work in a representative population of patients or if they only work in a subset of patients. So, every type of diversity is important here. It's important that we have a diversity of races and ethnicities, that we're not overrepresenting men or women, that we have patients with a range of health status, different medical comorbidities, different ages. And there certainly have been problems in the past where clinical trials may only enroll relatively healthy younger subjects. And once those drugs or other treatments are tested in a more real-world population, we discover that perhaps some of the patients who were underrepresented in those trials may not benefit as much as the patients who were enrolled. So there really is a push to have a much more diverse population of patients across all metrics enrolled on our trials.
How many trials do we have underway, and what's the long-term forecast for the number of trials we'll be supporting and enrolling for?
We have hundreds of trials open here at UC Davis, and we are constantly increasing our portfolio. At the same time, we want to maintain a high-quality portfolio of trials. So if a trial is not enrolling patients after 6 months or a year, that tends to suggest maybe our patients and our doctors are not as excited about whatever that trial is testing. So we may close that trial to make room for one that our patients and doctors are more excited about.
Well, and how do we engage with our community? And our catchment area is several counties, so it takes up a lot of California. But how do we engage with that population to help guide our clinical trials?
We do have a collaboration with many other centers in the greater Sacramento area for our Phase 1 clinical trials program, our SCOPE program. So to allow patients seeing oncologists at a range of sites across the greater Sacramento area to be referred to UC Davis for evaluation for a Phase 1 clinical trial while maintaining their relationship with their current oncologist closer to home. And once they finish enrollment on the Phase 1 trial, they typically go back to their own oncologist. So they're not actually having to transfer their care to another center. They're simply able to come to UC Davis, take part in a Phase 1 trial, and then go back and receive care closer to home. Really, any patient who is in the greater Sacramento area or beyond, we are always happy to see them for a consult simply to assess them for our clinical trial portfolio. We work with many doctors around the greater Sacramento area and beyond. We're happy to work with your local doctors and assess what options we might have here in our portfolio.
And I think if people want to request that type of consultation, they just need to go to the UC Davis Comprehensive Cancer Center website, click on clinical trials, there's a phone number, and they could simply call.
Absolutely.
Any exciting trials coming up that you want to tell us about?
Just to mention a couple of exciting trials that really were developed entirely here at UC Davis. There are several trials using something called a theranostic approach. So this is where ultimately a radioactive drug can be delivered that targets a tumor and radiates it within the body. And this is based on work from the lab of Julie Sutcliffe here at UC Davis. Her lab developed this approach over 15 to 20 years, targeting something called the alpha V beta 6 integrin. And this is a marker that's overexpressed in a range of cancers, including pancreatic cancer and lung cancer. And there's currently a trial open here, a phase 1 trial in pancreatic cancer patients, where patients do a low-dose PET scan using this marker. And if their tumor doesn't indeed express this marker, they can then receive these radioactive treatments to target their pancreatic cancer. And we will have a similar trial using the same approach in lung cancer patients, hopefully opening within the next 3 to 6 months.
And does that allow because you say highly targeted, I mean, it's basically like laser focused on just attacking that cancer and the affected cells, correct?
Well, that is the goal, and that's what we believe. But we ultimately need trials to establish that.
Definitely.
Anything else you'd like to mention?
I would encourage any patient with any research, any interest in taking part in a clinical trial, just want to reiterate to reach out to your doctor and ask about these options. Our doctors often will offer you clinical trials if one is obvious that you're a good fit for, but by all means, remind your doctors too, because oftentimes there may be things like imaging studies or future trials that aren't open yet that you might be able to take part in. So this is really a partnership between our patients and our physicians and everyone else who works here at UC Davis.
Well, thanks, Dr. Daly, for joining us today, and thank you for tuning in and listening. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us directly at beatcancer@ucdavis.edu. Beat Cancer is a production of the UC Davis Comprehensive Cancer Center. For more information on our NCI-designated Comprehensive Cancer Center, please visit health.ucdavis.edu/cancer.